Hello and welcome to another video. Today, I'd love it if you joined me on another time traveling adventure, but this time traveling with me to the future in my new Starfleet uniform. As I hope you can tell, this is a part of a larger cosplay, a gender-bent Ms. Data, based of course on my favorite Soong-type android, Lieutenant Commander Data. As a matter of fact, Ms. Data was my very first cosplay ever, and I've always wanted to revisit and update her with the experience of many years of sewing and cosplaying. So, if you'd like to learn how to make your own Starfleet uniform, or you're just here for the glow up, this is the video for you. So without any further ado, let's get into it. As always, I started with a pattern. Often I would make my own, but in this case I went with a pattern from Tailor's Gone Wild. This is their updated TNG jumpsuit pattern, and as it's thoroughly researched, including with the benefit of having had access to screen-used costumes, it seemed faster and easier to rely upon their expertise as opposed to making a pattern of my own. I liked this pattern. I can't speak to how clear the instructions for assembly are, as I didn't use them, but in terms of seam placement and fit, this pattern is bang on, and the supplemental material is detailed and thorough, so I'd imagine the instructions are top-notch also. With my pattern in hand, metaphorically speaking, I headed off to the fabric store. I like to visit lots of stores on Queen West, but what was especially fun here was that the store that had the fabrics I was looking for was the exact store where I got my fabrics for my original Ms. Data. They're very different fabrics, of course, but the symmetry of that was delightful, I think. Alright, I am back from the fabric stores and I have picked up what I need. So the things I picked up were some shoulder pads. You can make shoulder pads. I don't make my own shoulder pads. Absolutely not. I buy them. These are 99 cents each. These are $1 each, so I'm not making that. Zipper. Pattern calls for 22 inches, but I bought 24 because I like to have a little bit of extra wiggle room, just in case. I have my black two-way stretch, and this it actually does look a lot more Operations Gold, not on camera, but this really absolutely repellently colored stretch. Okay, so this is a better indicator of what this color actually is. I have no idea who would use this color other than for a Starfleet uniform, but the moment I saw it, I thought that is truly disgusting. It is repellent. It is absolutely perfect. You'll also notice it has very, very, very minor ribbing. This is actually great because a lot of the fabrics that were used in the original uniforms were actually very, very slightly ribbed, and you can see that on the remastered versions, which is super. So I have my pattern and I can get to cutting and then sewing. Woohoo! So here I am cutting the fabric, starting with the gold. In both cases, this is a two-way polyester stretch. I find two-way stretch slightly less versatile, but much easier to work with, as it stretches along only one grain. So that's what I used here. You can see I started with the contrast, laying my pattern pieces atop and tracing. It may look here as though I have too much fabric, but as the gold fabric was a little too thin, I planned on self-lining it. As I planned to flatline, this I did after cutting the necessary contrast pieces. One front piece, one of each back piece, and two each of the front and back sleeve pieces. After this, I simply laid the first set of pieces atop the fabric, pinned, and cut them out, leaving a little bit of extra around the seam allowances. This I find wastes only a negligible amount of fabric and is, for me at least, a much easier way to ensure that each lining piece most exactly matches its corresponding layer. Then I simply top stitched a 1/4 inch around the edge of each piece, leaving only the bottom of each sleeve open before trimming away the excess fabric. Before doing anything else, I also assembled the sleeves, which was a simple matter of matching the side seams and stitching. Do be aware that the pattern has an assortment of different seam allowances, all of which are marked very clearly. Most are 1/2 inch, but some are 5/8 of an inch, and one is 3/8 of an inch, so make sure you're paying attention. In terms of fit, in the grand scheme of things, making 1 or 2 seams 5/8 of an inch as opposed to a 1/2 inch really makes little difference. But when it comes to matching up the many pieces here, it would certainly make it much harder, so just be aware of the seam allowances. Then began my battle with the black two-way stretch, but more on that in a moment. I started by cutting out all the pieces except those for the pants, as I knew I planned to assemble the tunic portion first and wanted to get that out of the way. I find marking black fabric a bit of a pain, as really the only thing that shows up well is chalk, but luckily I have an assortment of chalks and this one worked quite well. With these pieces ready, I could start joining some of the simpler seams. I started by attaching the back yokes to each of their corresponding gold pieces, aligning them at the center back. You'll notice that there's an overhang, and that's intentional. The yokes extend onto the sleeve cap area to create a distinctive point, and it's both strikingly Starfleet and makes for the weirdest arm's eye into which I have ever set a sleeve. Then I attended to the side pieces. As there is a seam running directly under the armpit, there are 4 side pieces as opposed to 2, so each of these had to be joined both to its corresponding front or back piece, as well as to one another at that center side seam. In fact, I actually joined the side pieces to one another before attaching them to the front, as I wanted to get as many pieces connected as fast as possible and hadn't yet done the bust darts for the front. Speaking of bust darts, here they come. Sometimes I'd opt to thread mark my bust darts, but here I simply marked with Sharpie, folded the darts right sides together, stitched, and cut them open. I was delighted with how well the bust darts fit. I needed to make no modifications, which was pretty darn awesome. With the darts completed, I could join the side front pieces to the front, thus connecting front and back. The last piece comprising the tunic body was the front yoke, which I left at this point in order to fit it best both to the front piece but also to the back yokes, as the front and back yokes must be joined precisely at the shoulder seams. It was at this point that I noticed something. So, made a discovery. You can see what the discovery is, but I didn't know about this until I went upstairs to go to the bathroom, and I looked in the mirror, and the black fabric is not necessarily, the dye is not necessarily, shall we say, color fast. Normally we would expect to see that come off only in the wash if you have a non-color fast dye, though all dyes should be color fast. So that's kind of interesting. You should see the other guy. Undeterred, I connected the bottom front and popped the whole thing on the dress form. Here's what it looked like at this stage. The next day dawned and I set my sleeves. I have no footage of this because it was awful and I can't really give you any instructions except to do it in stages and try to make sure that everything matches up as well as possible. That was so much harder than it needed to be. And it's not even fully perfect yet. This will change when it's fully fitted to me, but you'll notice this side looks a little bit better. But that was the worst. That is the worst I have ever experienced for setting sleeves, and I've set a lot of sleeves at this point. That was so terrible. You'll notice also that that part looks okay, but there's like this wrinkling, which is a result of, oh my gosh, the number of times I put that seam in. Anyway, I'm gonna move on to the collar now and just pray that that will be a little bit easier, but oh my goodness. The challenges here were mainly the fact that this is a weird arm side thanks to the yoke, that I actually had very little ease with which to work, that I find it irritating to seam things to a precise point, and that everything here had to match as perfectly as possible between left and right. Some sleeves are pretty easy to set, these were not. As promised, here's the collar. The pattern recommends fusible interfacing, which is a great product, but I opted instead for some scraps of linen I had left over from another project. I didn't need the collar to be extremely stiff, just with a bit of extra body, so I simply flatlined each collar piece again within the seam allowance. Then I laid each piece atop the black stretch, right sides together, and stitched along the top edge with that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. With this completed, I trimmed away the excess seam allowance and turned the collar pieces right way out, stitching everything wrong sides together, again within that seam allowance. I also cut lengths of the gold fabric to pipe the edges of the collar pieces. Ordinarily, I would fold and stitch in a length of cord to create nice rounded piping, but this fabric had so much body on its own that all I needed to do was fold it in half before binding the top edge to each collar piece. This I did with my preferred method, which is to stitch to the desired width, fold the fabric over the back, and stitch in the ditch to secure. Then I simply pinned the collar pieces in place and seamed them to the joined yokes, clipping the seams as necessary. Pants next. This was pretty simple. Due to the asymmetry of the design, each leg piece is unique, and so I cut one of each for a total of 4, a front and a back piece for left and right, respectively. I seamed the pants with my preferred method, which is to join the front pieces to one another and the back pieces to one another at the crotch first. Then I laid the front and back right sides together atop each other and sewed up the inseam in one continuous seam before joining the sides. The level at which the black fabric was shedding dye was really starting to scare me at this point, but I was close to the end of assembly, so I simply persevered. This was simple in principle, merely pinning the top of the legs to the bottom of the tunic and sewing everything together, but I made sure to take my time in order to best line up the seams. It's not 100% perfect, I'd give it a 98, but perfection is the enemy of progress, so I'm quite content with this. Again, the pattern here did a bang-up job of ensuring that everything matched, so again, I was pleased with the investment. Oh, and of course I also put in a zipper, but again, and this is becoming a refrain, I don't have footage of that. While I am fully functional in my ability to put in zippers, it is neither a pretty nor educational process. If you'd like to learn how to insert a zipper, I recommend you check out a creator who is far more elegant at it. At this point, I could ignore the dye problem no longer, so after test washing some fabric scraps, I gave the whole uniform a bath using my gentlest method, hand washing in the bathtub using dish soap and cool to warm water only. Also, you might wonder why I simply didn't wash these fabrics before using them, and that's an excellent question. The answer is, quite simply, I've never needed to, and quite frankly, I also object on principle to the idea of having to maintain your fabrics before even using them. Fabrics should be dyed with color-fast dyes that don't come out. They simply shouldn't shed dye like this. Additionally, many of my costumes are made of fabrics that simply can't be washed with traditional methods, and for all these reasons, I'm just not used to pre-washing fabrics. Also, as a wise woman once said, ain't nobody got time for that. I also had to clean off my sewing machine, which was a new one for me. Oh my gosh, it's still not even all coming off. I'm gonna have to use ethanol? You gotta be kidding me. 99% ethanol it is. I love 99% ethanol. It's a great way of finding out where all your hangnails are. With my jumpsuit mostly finished and no longer staining everything it touched, including me, I could hem. For the pants, I cut open the vent and bound the edges, as I wanted to preserve as much length as possible. For the sleeves, I simply folded the hem inwards and whip-stitched the seam allowance to the lining. Another note here, you might notice that the inside of this costume is quite messy. Well, the originals have messy insides too, for the same reasons that I do. First, the fabric used in both cases doesn't fray, so there's no need to finish the seams to prevent that fraying. The second is that the fabrics are quite soft, so there's no danger of a raw edge causing discomfort to the wearer. The third is timing. Quite simply, finishing seams takes time, and given reason number 4, which is that costumes such as these aren't actually worn all that many times in their lifetime, proper finishing is unnecessary. There are many circumstances in which you want to deal with your seams, but only if it's going to improve the look, comfort, or lifespan of the garment. In this case, finishing the seams added no benefit, so I simply didn't do it. Time for the finishing touches. These were pips and a comm badge. Again, I have no footage of the process because I hated it, but these are made of painted thebra over an EVA foam base. You'll note I made a few extras here. These are to update my dad's Captain Picard, so I made extra pips and 2 comm badges. After struggling to make the badges, I eventually realized that I could use a purchased comm badge as a sort of reverse mold, using my heat gun to melt the thebra over top of the existing badge to create a duplicate, which I then painted, cackling delightedly to myself that I'd discovered a new trick. As I always say, some days I feel like MacGyver, but most days I feel like Red Green. Blessedly, I think this was a MacGyver day. The pips I attached with cyanoacrylate glue, which is super crazy or Gorilla Glue based on your brand, and the comm badge with Velcro. Easy peasy. And that's it. This was a pretty quick project, and I'm actually delighted because provided all goes well, I will be debuting my updated Ms. Data at Montreal Comic-Con 2024. So if you're there, don't be shy. Please come up and say hello to this android. As always, thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to support me, a like or comment on any of my videos is much appreciated, and you can check out the rest of my channel for my other adventures in time travel. If you'd like to see what I get up to on a daily basis, all my socials are down in the description box. Regardless, thank you so much for being here, take care, and I'll see you next time.